Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog lay thick upon Baker Street that morning, drifting in grey tendrils past our windows and lending an air of mystery to even the most mundane of London's thoroughfares. I had arrived at 221B to find my friend Sherlock Holmes in one of his contemplative moods, seated in his familiar chair with his long, pale fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen grey eyes fixed upon the dancing flames in our hearth as though reading some secret message written in their flickering patterns. The fire cast wavering shadows across his aquiline features, accentuating the sharp angles of his face and the intensity of his gaze. It was a look I had come to recognize over our years of association, the expression of a mind poised on the very edge of discovery, waiting for that final piece of evidence that would transform speculation into certainty. Holmes possessed that rare gift of absolute concentration, the ability to focus his formidable intellect upon a problem with such intensity that the world around him seemed to fade into insignificance. "You are unusually quiet this morning, Holmes," I ventured, settling into my own chair and reaching for my morning paper. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging my presence with the faintest of smiles. "I am considering the curious case of a gentleman who appears to have forgotten the most fundamental of human activities, Watson. Tell me, in your medical experience, have you ever encountered a patient who simply ceased to breathe without apparent cause?" Before I could formulate a proper response to this peculiar question, the sound of a brougham drawing up sharply at our door interrupted our conversation. Heavy footsteps ascended the 17 steps with evident urgency, followed by Mrs. Hudson's discreet knock and the entrance of a gentleman whose bearing immediately proclaimed him a person of considerable importance and equally considerable distress. He was a man of middle years, impeccably dressed in the dark, formal attire befitting his station, yet there was something in his manner that spoke of barely controlled anxiety. His face, though composed by years of diplomatic training, bore the telltale signs of a sleepless night, and his hands, I noticed, trembled slightly as he removed his silk hat. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of one accustomed to moving in the highest circles of society. "I am Sir Felix Harting, Permanent Secretary at the Home Office. I come to you because Scotland Yard has proven inadequate to address a matter of the most delicate and baffling nature." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite his own, his posture indicating immediate attention. "Pray be seated, Sir Felix. You appear to be a man pressed by both time and circumstance." "Indeed I am," Sir Felix replied, settling into the offered chair with evident relief. "What I must tell you concerns my brother, Mr. Aubrey Harting, who was discovered dead in his study in Kensington at 3:45 this morning under circumstances that defy all rational explanation." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharpening with interest. "Continue." "The room was locked from the inside, Mr. Holmes. The key was in the lock, the windows were fastened and shuttered, and there was no other means of entry or exit. My brother was found seated at his writing desk as though he had simply fallen asleep at his work. There were no signs of violence, no indication of struggle, no evidence of poison or any other external cause of death. The family physician and Inspector Lestrade himself are prepared to declare it a case of syncope and close the matter, but there are circumstances surrounding his death that are both unaccountable and deeply troubling." Watson observed the change that came over Holmes at these words, the subtle straightening of his posture, the increased intensity of his gaze, the way his fingers began their characteristic drumming upon the arm of his chair. It was the transformation that invariably occurred when a case presented itself that promised to challenge his extraordinary deductive abilities. "My brother had suffered recently from asthma," Sir Felix continued, his voice growing more strained as he recounted the details. He had taken to wearing one of those wire gauze respirators when exposed to the east wind, and had been following a peculiar regimen prescribed by a certain practitioner, a system of measured breathing timed to a metronome. He laughed about it to me, calling it nonsense, but I know he practiced it religiously in the privacy of his study. Sir Felix paused, drawing a shuddering breath before continuing. He was found with his head thrown back slightly, Mr. Holmes, and there was an expression of perfect serenity upon his face. It is that tranquillity that haunts me. The metronome was still ticking when they found him. His respirator lay in his lap. It was as though he had simply forgotten to breathe. Holmes's eyes glittered with the familiar fire of intellectual challenge. You mentioned that Inspector Lestrade was involved. What was his assessment of the scene? Lestrade examined the room thoroughly but found nothing to suggest foul play. The door had to be forced when my brother failed to respond to his valet's morning knock. Every window was secured from within, the chimney too narrow for human passage. Yet there are details that trouble me greatly, Mr. Holmes. The bell rope in his study, the cord for summoning the servants, had been cut cleanly through with the tassel found lying in the cold fireplace. Why would a man cut his own bell rope before dying? Most curious indeed, Holmes murmured. What else? On his desk lay an unfinished note addressed simply to R. Only 2 words were clearly legible. Remind me. The rest had blotted on the reverse side of the paper, where the words, mind me to breathe, could be made out as plainly as if they had been written deliberately. The servants have already begun whispering about it, calling him the gentleman who forgot to breathe. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out into the swirling fog that continued to shroud the street below. Was there any unusual odour in the room? Yes, though I hesitate to trust my senses given the circumstances. Something sweet and faint, reminiscent of elderflower syrup, though my brother detested such scents and had recently forbidden even the violets in the drawing-room. And the valet you mentioned? Sir Felix's expression darkened. Henry Timpson, who had served my brother faithfully for 2 years. He departed the house at dawn before anyone else was stirring, taking only his personal belongings. He has not returned, and his whereabouts are unknown. Holmes turned from the window, his decision evidently made. Sir Felix, you have presented me with a problem of considerable interest. If Dr. Watson can be spared from his practice, we shall examine this locked room and its mysteries immediately. Time, as you have correctly observed, is of the essence in such matters. As we prepared to depart for Kensington, I could not help but notice the gleam of satisfaction in Holmes's eyes. Here was a puzzle worthy of his talents, a death that appeared impossible, clues that seemed to contradict themselves, and a mystery that promised to test the very limits of logical deduction. The game, as my friend would say, was afoot. The hansom that bore us through the fog-shrouded streets moved like a phantom through London's grey arteries, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on wet cobblestones providing a steady counterpoint to our contemplative silence. Holmes sat opposite me, his keen eyes fixed upon the passing scene, yet I knew his extraordinary mind was already dissecting the peculiar details Sir Felix had presented. The fog began to lift as we approached Kensington, revealing the respectable Georgian facades that characterized this fashionable district. The Harting residence stood imposingly behind iron railings, its red brick gleaming wetly in the pale morning light. A uniformed constable at the entrance lent an official gravity to the otherwise genteel dwelling. Inspector Lestrade emerged as our cab drew to a halt, his sharp features bearing that expression of professional satisfaction I had come to recognize when he believed a case was well in hand. Holmes, Watson, Lestrade greeted us with barely concealed triumph. Come to observe a straightforward case of natural causes, I expect. Sir Felix seems convinced there's mystery here, but I assure you, we've examined every inch of that study. Nothing untoward, nothing for the yard to lose sleep over. His chest puffed slightly with evident pride in what he considered a swift resolution. Holmes merely nodded, his expression unreadable. Natural causes often present themselves in most unnatural circumstances, Inspector. Perhaps you would lead us to the late Mr. Harting's study. We followed through elegantly appointed rooms that spoke of refined tastes and scholarly pursuits. The house possessed that peculiar stillness that settles upon a residence touched by sudden death, as though the very walls held their breath in reverence. A faint, cloying sweetness lingered in the air, growing more pronounced as we approached the heavy oak door of the study, its splintered frame bearing witness to the morning's forced entry. The study itself was a comfortable chamber overlooking a small garden, dominated by a large mahogany desk positioned to capture the natural light. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents suggesting wide-ranging interests in natural philosophy and Eastern mysticism. The brass metronome Sir Felix had mentioned sat prominently upon a side table, its silent presence somehow more ominous than if it had been ticking. Mr. Aubrey Harting remained seated at his desk, his head tilted back slightly, spectacles still perched upon his nose. His expression bore that serene tranquillity Sir Felix had described, creating an unsettling contrast with the rigid stillness of death. The wire gauze respirator lay in his lap like a discarded muzzle, while the unfinished note remained upon the desk blotter, its partial message tantalizingly incomplete. Holmes wasted no time on preliminaries. His investigation began with a methodical circuit of the room's perimeter, ignoring the body initially to focus on the physical evidence. He examined the splintered doorframe with his magnifying glass, testing the lock mechanism before moving to inspect each window latch and sill for any sign of disturbance. The shutters were indeed secured from within, their iron bars making external entry impossible. At the fireplace, Holmes knelt to examine the severed bell rope's tassel lying among the cold cinders. He studied the cut end intently, noting its clean, deliberate nature. When he moved to touch the brass plate surrounding the rope's wall aperture, I observed him close his eyes momentarily, as though listening for some delicate inner sound. A faint discoloration appeared upon his glove, which he regarded with unmistakable satisfaction. "The windows show no disturbance," he murmured, running a strip of paper along the door's threshold. When lifted, it bore the faintest smear of grit and minute black granules. He approached the desk finally, circling it with predatory precision, his nostrils slightly dilated as he detected the lingering sweet scent. "Your brother's physician," Holmes said, turning to Sir Felix. "This Dr. Alaric Royston, who prescribed the breathing regimen, what manner of man is he?" "A specialist in respiratory disorders, keeping rooms in Duke Street. Rather unconventional in his methods, but my brother swore by his treatments." Holmes lifted the respirator by its cloth ties, holding the gauze before his face without allowing contact. "Dr. Watson, what do you detect?" I inhaled cautiously. The sweet scent was more definite here, with an underlying medicinal quality I could not immediately identify. There is an odor, not ether, not precisely chloroform, something akin to a cordial used to mask unpleasant draughts. Holmes nodded as one who has secured his witness. The metronome drew his attention next, and he wound the mechanism, listening intently to its steady 48 beats per minute. The rhythmic sound filled the study with mechanical precision, emphasizing the unnatural silence that had settled upon this chamber of death. As I watched his aquiline features, I could see the wheels of his extraordinary mind turning, processing each detail, in search of the pattern that would unlock this most perplexing mystery. The metronome's steady rhythm seemed to emphasize the unnatural stillness that had settled upon the room, each mechanical tick marking time that no longer held meaning for the figure seated at the mahogany desk. Holmes allowed the device to continue its relentless count for several moments before silencing it with a decisive gesture, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he absorbed the peculiar atmosphere that pervaded the study. Moving with the methodical precision that characterized his investigative approach, Holmes approached the deceased Mr. Harting and began his examination of the body itself. He loosened the collar with practiced efficiency and felt along the line of the jaw and throat, his keen eyes noting details that would escape less trained observation. In the cold grey light filtering through the windows, the dead man's complexion revealed a peculiar slate hue most apparent at the ears and fingertips, while a faint rosiness lingered about the lips and beneath the fingernails. "Watson," Holmes murmured, lifting one of the deceased's hands and allowing it to fall again. "Observe the coloration. What does your medical training suggest?" I approached with professional interest, studying the pallor and positioning of the body. "The rosiness you've noted suggests adequate oxygenation at the time of death, Holmes. Most curious for a man who supposedly ceased breathing. The slate coloration, however, indicates circulatory failure, though the overall presentation is inconsistent with typical respiratory distress." Holmes nodded with satisfaction, producing his magnifying glass to examine the fine hairs within the nostrils and along the moustache. "Note the minute luster here, Watson, as of an oil. There is also a faint yellowing at the tips of these hairs." He touched the inner rim of the nostril with the head of a pin, then moved to the respirator that lay in the deceased's lap. Holding the wire gauze device at arm's length, Holmes warmed it gently with a lighted taper. The sweet scent that had been lingering in the study intensified immediately, taking on a sharper, more medicinal quality that was distinctly different from simple elderflower syrup. As he examined the gauze more closely, I observed him note a faint, crystalline sheen on some of the inner fibers, particularly concentrated where the device would have made closest contact with the wearer's breathing. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice carrying that particular tone of quiet authority I had learned to recognize. "You mentioned that the valet departed at dawn. Was this his customary hour?" Lestrade consulted his notebook with evident reluctance. According to the cook, Timson typically began his duties at 7. His departure before dawn was most unusual. The under-housemaid saw him leaving through the servants' entrance with a single valise, moving with considerable haste. Holmes wrapped the respirator carefully in paper before turning his attention to the severed bell rope. He examined not merely the cut end, but ran his gloved finger along the remaining portion attached to the wall, paying particular attention to the small brass plate where it emerged. I observed him pause, his brow furrowed in concentration as a greyish-white residue clung to his glove. With a small screwdriver from his pocket case, he loosened the brass escutcheon that guided the cord into the wall. "You observe, Inspector?" Holmes held the inner face of the plate toward the window. The surface was faintly dulled as though by a thin coating, and upon the brick, just beyond, there was a clean ellipse amid the general dust, as if some small object had recently been removed. He sniffed the cavity briefly before closing it again. "We shall not disturb that further." The cut end of the rope itself revealed a remarkably clean edge under magnification, almost surgical in its precision, yet the fibers around the cut appeared slightly singed, as if by sudden, intense heat. Holmes placed the severed tassel in an evidence envelope with the same care he might reserve for the most precious artifact. Returning to the desk, Holmes surveyed the arrangement of papers without disturbing more than necessary. The unfinished note drew his particular attention, and when he held the blotter to the light, the ghostly impression of the obliterated words became clearly visible. "Sir Felix, your brother's handwriting, was he in the habit of pressing heavily with his pen?" "Quite the contrary," Sir Felix replied, approaching to peer over Holmes's shoulder. Aubrey had the lightest touch imaginable. He often joked that his correspondence looked as though it had been written by a ghost. Holmes's expression grew more thoughtful as he noted this inconsistency. Beneath a pile of receipts, he uncovered a narrow visiting card embossed in black. Dr. Alaric Royston, Respiratory Therapeutics, Duke Street, St. James's. Tucked with it was a chemist's account made out to Mr. Aubrey Harting for various items including spirit of nitre and inhalant essence, dated a fortnight past. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, his keen eyes moving from the chemical purchases to the deceased man's serene expression. He knelt once more at the fireplace, sifting through the cold ashes with tweezers and extracting several small fragments that he wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Among the cinders he discovered a pearl of glass no larger than a pea, fused and opaque, which he examined with particular interest before secreting it in his pocket. Holmes summoned the housemaid, a solemn girl with reddened eyelids who confirmed that her master could not abide scents of any kind. "No flowers in the rooms, sir, and he'd have me air the place whenever the footman's polish smelt too strong. Only his own medicines, which he kept locked, save for the little bottle in the study for his breathing." When asked about the bell rope, she revealed that it had been giving trouble lately, ringing of its own accord when wind came down the chimney, necessitating that it be wedged to prevent false alarms in the pantry. As the morning light grew stronger, casting sharp shadows across the study and highlighting details that had been obscured by the earlier gloom, Holmes stood slowly, his expression that of a man who had begun to perceive the outline of a complex puzzle. The various elements, the chemical residues, the severed bell rope, the inconsistent handwriting, the missing valet, and the peculiar circumstances of death were beginning to form a pattern in his extraordinary mind. "You observe, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his gaze encompassing the entire scene, "how our gentleman detested perfumes, and yet this room speaks otherwise. An inconsistency is the lever by which a fact may be prized loose." He paused at the doorway, looking back once more upon the tranquil figure at the desk. "There is a hand upon this, Watson, and it is not the hand that ran away. Our gentleman did not forget to breathe. He was persuaded to stop." The implications of Holmes's words hung in the air like the lingering sweet scent that had first alerted us to the true nature of this mystery. As we prepared to leave the study, I could see that my friend had already begun to construct the framework of a solution, though he kept his growing understanding carefully concealed from both Lestrade's dismissive certainty and Sir Felix's anxious hope for answers. The implications of Holmes's final observation settled upon our small party with the weight of revealed truth, transforming what had appeared to be a case of natural death into something far more sinister. As we descended from the study, I observed Sir Felix's features tighten with a mixture of vindication and growing alarm, while Inspector Lestrade's expression shifted from professional confidence to barely concealed irritation at having his conclusions so methodically dismantled. Holmes paused in the main hallway, his keen eyes surveying the domestic arrangements with the same intensity he had brought to bear upon the death chamber above. "Mrs. Pemberton," he addressed the cook, a formidable woman whose red-rimmed eyes spoke of genuine grief, "I require a detailed account of last evening's routine, particularly regarding Mr. Harting's habits and any unusual behaviour among the staff." The cook curtsied awkwardly, her hands twisting in her apron as she gathered her thoughts. "Mr. Aubrey, was a most particular about his breathing treatments, sir. Every evening at 9 sharp, he'd lock himself in the study with that contraption of his, following the doctor's orders precise-like. We could hear that ticking machine through the walls, steady as clockwork for exactly 90 minutes. Last night seemed no different at first, except for Henry Timpson's peculiar behaviour. Holmes stepped forward with that particular intensity that marked his pursuit of a significant detail. Describe Timpson's conduct throughout the day. He was acting most strange, sir, checking his pocket watch every few minutes and pacing about the servants' hall like a man expecting bad news. When I asked what troubled him, he claimed it was nothing, but his hands shook when he poured the evening tea. Then, when the ticking stopped upstairs at 10:30, exactly when it always did, he went all still-like, listening hard with his head cocked toward the ceiling. The under-housemaid, emboldened by her superior's candour, added in a trembling voice, "He received a letter yesterday morning, sir, brought by a boy who wouldn't wait for an answer. Henry went white as milk when he read it, and I saw him burn it in the kitchen fire straight away. After that, he kept muttering to himself and checking that the study windows were properly secured." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me, and I recognized the satisfaction that flickered across his aquiline features. "Show me the bellboard," he commanded, and we were led down a narrow corridor to a cupboard-like office where brass indicators marked the various rooms of the house. The bell-labelled study hung slightly askew, and Holmes immediately noted the folded wedge of card thrust beneath its spring mechanism. "To prevent false alarms," the cook explained, "as the bell had been giving trouble lately, ringing of its own accord when wind came down the chimney." Holmes examined the wedge with his magnifying glass, then carefully removed it to observe the bell's response. As it began to quiver slightly, he struck a match and held the flame near the aperture where the wire emerged from the wall. The flame bowed and guttered outward, responding to a faint current of air that spoke of some communication beyond mere mechanical connection. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "I believe an examination of the valet's quarters would prove illuminating before we proceed further." We ascended to the servants' quarters where Henry Timpson's modest room bore the stark emptiness of hasty abandonment. Holmes immediately began his methodical search, discovering beneath the floorboards a small fragment of paper bearing part of an address, Uke Street, St. James's along, with what appeared to be house numbers. More significantly, wrapped carefully in cloth beneath the mattress, he found a small glass vial that had been emptied but retained a distinctive residual odour. When Holmes removed the cork and inhaled cautiously, his expression grew decidedly grave. "Watson, your medical opinion on this scent, if you please." I accepted the vial and detected immediately the same sweet medicinal aroma that had pervaded the study below, though here it was concentrated and unmistakable. Beneath the cloying sweetness lay something sharper, more volatile, that set my professional instincts on immediate alert. "The same essence we encountered in the study," I confirmed, "but in much greater concentration. There are traces of ether present, but combined with something else entirely. This was no legitimate medical preparation." Holmes wrapped the vial carefully, adding it to his growing collection of evidence. The window of Timpson's room, I noted, commanded an excellent view of the study windows below, providing perfect observation of his master's evening routine. As we prepared to depart, Holmes turned to Sir Felix with renewed purpose. "Your brother's association with Dr. Royston, when did it begin, and what precisely did these treatments entail?" "Perhaps 6 months ago," Sir Felix replied thoughtfully. Aubrey suffered increasingly from his asthmatic condition, and conventional treatments had proven inadequate. Dr. Royston claimed to practice a revolutionary approach involving controlled breathing techniques derived from Eastern mysticism, combined with specially prepared inhalants to enhance respiratory function. Holmes nodded grimly, the various threads of evidence beginning to weave themselves into a coherent pattern in his extraordinary mind. The timing of Timpson's suspicious behavior, the sophisticated chemical preparation found in his room, the deliberate manipulation of the bell system, and the connection to Dr. Royston's unconventional treatments all pointed toward a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication. This was no crime of passion or desperation, Holmes observed, as our hansom prepared to depart the Harting residence. What we have uncovered suggests careful planning, specialized knowledge, and access to dangerous chemicals. Timpson may have been the instrument, but he was certainly not the architect of this elaborate deception. The fog had begun to lift as we made our way through London's grey streets, revealing the city in all its Victorian complexity. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture that indicated deep mental activity. The case of the gentleman who forgot to breathe was revealing layers of deception that extended far beyond a simple domestic crime. "Duke Street, Watson," Holmes said finally, his voice carrying that note of quiet determination that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductive triumphs. "Dr. Alaric, Royston awaits our attention, and I suspect he holds the key to understanding precisely how a man might be persuaded to cease breathing while maintaining such perfect serenity in death." The hansom that conveyed us through London's increasingly congested thoroughfares provided Holmes with the contemplative silence he required to arrange the morning's discoveries into their proper sequence. As we approached the fashionable district of St. James's, I observed my friend's expression grow more focused, that familiar intensity settling upon his aquiline features that invariably preceded his most penetrating interrogations. Duke Street proved to be a narrow thoroughfare lined with respectable Georgian buildings, their uniform facades broken by the occasional brass nameplate announcing the presence of various professional establishments. The address we sought occupied the upper floors of a building whose ground level housed a perfumer's shop from which the faintest breath of attar and exotic essences drifted upward to mingle with the more conventional odours of beeswax and carbolic that marked Dr. Royston's medical practice. The waiting room into which we were eventually admitted bore the unmistakable stamp of unconventional medicine. Eastern tapestries adorned the walls alongside testimonials from grateful patients, while the air carried that same sweet, medicinal scent we had encountered at the Harting residence, though here it was overlaid with incense and the sharper notes of various chemical preparations. A collection of curious apparatus occupied glass cases along one wall, including several wire gauze respirators and what appeared to be distillation equipment of unusual sophistication. Dr. Alaric Royston himself proved to be a man of striking appearance and evident cultivation. Tall and spare, with prematurely silver hair and penetrating pale eyes behind rimless spectacles, he possessed that particular combination of scholarly authority and barely concealed nervousness that often characterized practitioners of questionable methods. His clothing, while respectable, showed the telltale stains and residues that spoke of frequent exposure to various chemical substances. "Gentlemen," he greeted us with urbane gravity, though I detected a slight tremor in his voice, "I trust this visit does not concern poor Mr. Harting's unfortunate demise. I have already provided Inspector Lestrade with a complete account of my professional relationship with the deceased." Holmes accepted the offered chair with that deceptive casualness that masked his most intense scrutiny. "Indeed, Doctor, we are most interested in your revolutionary breathing techniques. Perhaps you would be so kind as to demonstrate the precise apparatus you prescribe for Mr. Harting's condition." The consulting room into which Dr. Royston led us might have served as a small laboratory. Metronomes of various sizes occupied a side table, their scales marked in pencil to indicate different therapeutic tempos, A wall chart displayed detailed diagrams of the human respiratory system, with arrows indicating the rise and fall of the ribs under controlled breathing. Most significantly, a collection of numbered glass bulbs arranged upon shelves suggested the systematic preparation of various inhalant compounds. "My methods," Dr. Royston began with obvious reluctance, "combine ancient Eastern breathing disciplines with modern pharmacological enhancement of respiratory function. The patient follows a carefully timed regimen while inhaling therapeutic vapors designed to optimize oxygen absorption and calm nervous agitation." Holmes moved with apparent casualness to examine the metronomes, setting one to tick at exactly 48 beats per minute. The rhythmic sound filled the room with mechanical precision, and I observed Dr. Royston's slight flinch at the familiar tempo. "Your inhalant essences, Doctor," Holmes continued smoothly, "I observe they are numbered according to some systematic arrangement." The physician's hands began to tremble more noticeably as Holmes lifted one of the bottles and removed its cork. The familiar sweet scent immediately filled the room, though here it was accompanied by sharper, more volatile components that made my professional instincts alert to potential danger. "The formulations are proprietary," Dr. Royston said hastily, attempting to retrieve the bottle from Holmes's grasp, "based upon extensive research into the medicinal properties of various plant essences combined with certain mineral solutions to enhance their therapeutic effect." Holmes retained possession while producing his magnifying glass to examine the contents more closely. "Most interesting. I note there are places for 4 such preparations in your display case, yet only 3 are present. Was Mr. Harting perhaps receiving a specialized compound?" The effect of this observation upon Dr. Royston was immediate and telling. His already pale complexion became positively ashen, and his eyes darted involuntarily toward a door marked "Private" before returning to Holmes's implacable gaze. "Those are merely for demonstration purposes," he stammered. "Each patient's allotment is prepared fresh, according to their specific requirements. My assistant will have removed one for cleaning." Holmes drifted toward the private door, testing its handle with that casual insolence that so often disarmed the unprepared. Beyond lay what was unmistakably a sophisticated chemical laboratory equipped with distillation apparatus far more complex than anything required for simple respiratory therapy. Glass retorts and condensing chambers spoke of processes requiring precise temperature control and careful purification. "You maintain quite extensive facilities, Doctor," Holmes observed, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the laboratory arrangement. "Tell me, were you acquainted with Mr. Harting's valet, Henry Timpson? A most diligent fellow, I understand, in ensuring his master followed your prescribed regimen." Dr. Royston's composure, already strained, showed further cracks at this direct question. "I know nothing of any valet," he replied too quickly. "My professional relationship was exclusively with Mr. Harting himself. I provided treatment protocols and the necessary preparations, nothing more." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his attention apparently caught by a small detail on Dr. Royston's desk. "Your fingernails, Doctor, are remarkably well maintained for one who works regularly with chemical preparations. Yet I observe upon your cuff a faint residue that suggests recent handling of volatile essences, particularly those designed to penetrate wire gauze barriers." The physician's glance fell involuntarily to his sleeve before returning to Holmes with a controlled smile that failed to reach his eyes. "You see phantoms, Mr. Holmes. I compounded several preparations this morning. It is the merest residue of legitimate medical practice." We took our leave with the conventional courtesies, though the atmosphere had grown decidedly strained. As we descended to the street, Holmes's expression bore that particular satisfaction that indicated significant progress in his investigation, though he kept his conclusions carefully to himself. "An interesting gentleman, our Dr. Royston," Holmes observed as we walked toward the main thoroughfare. "His apparatus is sophisticated, his knowledge extensive, and his nervousness profound. The missing fourth preparation troubles me greatly, Watson, as does his immediate denial of any connection with the valet Timson." The fog had begun to lift, revealing London in all its complex Victorian reality, yet I sensed that the mystery surrounding the gentleman who forgot to breathe was only beginning to reveal its true dimensions. Holmes's methodical investigation had uncovered another layer of deception, and I could see in his keen grey eyes the growing certainty that we were dealing with a crime of remarkable sophistication and cold-blooded calculation. "We shall send word to Lestrade regarding the valet's whereabouts," Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of quiet determination that invariably preceded his most brilliant, deductive triumphs. "But first, Watson, I believe a visit to the chemist who supplied Dr. Royston's more exotic ingredients may prove illuminating. The game grows more complex with each revelation, and I suspect we have yet to encounter its true architect." The chemist's establishment that Holmes selected with characteristic precision occupied a narrow frontage in Jermyn Street, its modest window display suggesting discretion rather than ostentation. The brass nameplate reading Mortimer & Sons Analytical Chemists bore the green patina of established respectability, while the interior arrangements spoke of serious scientific endeavour rather than mere commercial enterprise. Mr. Tobias Mortimer proved to be a precise gentleman of middle years whose ink-stained fingers and methodical manner immediately proclaimed his professional competence. His establishment carried that distinctive atmosphere of careful chemistry where the sharp, clean odours of various reagents mingled with the more familiar scents of conventional medicines. Glass cabinets displayed an impressive array of labelled specimens, while the counter bore the tools of his trade arranged with mathematical precision. "Dr. Royston has indeed been a valued client for several months," Mortimer confirmed, when Holmes presented the chemist's account we had discovered at the Harting residence. "His requirements have been somewhat specialized, involving compounds not commonly requested by conventional practitioners. I maintain complete records, naturally, as required by law." Holmes examined the ledger with that methodical attention that characterized his most productive investigations. The entries revealed a pattern of increasingly sophisticated purchases, beginning with simple respiratory stimulants and progressing through various exotic preparations toward compounds, whose very names suggested applications far removed from ordinary medical practice. "These final entries," Holmes observed, his finger tracing the relevant notations, "they represent a considerable departure from Dr. Royston's earlier requirements. Spirit of nitre in concentrated form, purified ether, and what you term here aromatic essence for masking disagreeable vapours." Mortimer consulted his own notes with evident care. The doctor explained that he was developing a new inhalant compound for cases of severe nervous agitation. The aromatic essence was essential to render the treatment acceptable to sensitive patients, particularly those with an aversion to medicinal odours. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, though I detected that familiar intensity in his grey eyes that indicated significant discoveries. "The delivery method for these preparations. Did Dr. Royston specify any particular requirements regarding containers or apparatus?" "Indeed he did," Mortimer replied, warming to his subject with professional pride. "He required small glass ampoules of unusual design, spherical rather than cylindrical, with walls thin enough to be easily crushed when the contents were needed. He also requested rubber tubing of narrow bore with specialized fittings, explaining that his new therapeutic approach required precise control over the delivery of vapors to his patients." The implications of these technical details were not lost upon Holmes, whose expression grew increasingly grave as the chemist continued his account. Did Dr. Royston collect these materials personally, or were they delivered to his premises? He sent a representative on several occasions, Mortimer explained, a gentleman of careful manner who seemed well versed in the handling of delicate chemical preparations. Fair-haired, with a particular habit of consulting his pocket watch frequently during our transactions, he presented proper authorization and payment, though I must confess his nervous disposition struck me as unusual for one supposedly familiar with such materials. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me, and I recognized the satisfaction that flickered across his aquiline features. The description unmistakably identified Henry Timpson, though the valet's apparent knowledge of chemical procedures suggested preparation far beyond what might be expected from an ordinary domestic servant. The gentleman's most recent visit, Holmes continued, when did it occur, and what specific materials did he collect? Mortimer turned several pages in his ledger before locating the relevant entry. 3 days passed in the afternoon. He collected a complete set of the glass ampoules, freshly prepared according to Dr. Royston's specifications, along with the rubber apparatus and a quantity of activated charcoal powder. He seemed particularly anxious to complete the transaction quickly, claiming his master required the materials for an urgent case. Holmes's attention sharpened at the mention of charcoal powder. For what purpose did Dr. Royston require this particular substance? He claimed it was essential for purifying the air in his treatment chambers, Mortimer replied, though his tone suggested some professional skepticism. He explained that the charcoal would absorb any lingering chemical vapors that might prove disagreeable to subsequent patients. We departed the chemist's establishment with Holmes maintaining that contemplative silence that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductive leaps. The technical details we had uncovered, the specialized glass ampoules designed for easy crushing, the narrow rubber tubing with precise fittings, and the charcoal powder for absorbing residual vapors, were beginning to form a pattern in his extraordinary mind. "The apparatus grows clearer, Watson," Holmes observed as we walked through the increasingly crowded streets of central London. "We have a delivery system of considerable sophistication designed to introduce specific vapors into a confined space while leaving minimal trace of their presence. The charcoal serves not merely to purify the air, but to eliminate evidence of the chemical intervention itself." I found myself considering the medical implications of the compounds Mortimer had described. The combination of concentrated ether with spirit of nitre would produce profound effects upon the respiratory system, Holmes. In sufficient concentration, such vapors could indeed cause a person to cease breathing while maintaining an appearance of natural repose. Holmes nodded grimly, his keen mind already racing ahead to the next logical step in our investigation. "Yet we still lack the crucial element, Watson, the precise mechanism by which these deadly vapors were introduced into a locked room without the knowledge or consent of the victim. The bell rope, the metronome, the severed cord. These details suggest a system of remarkable ingenuity. As we secured a hansom for our return to Baker Street, I observed that Holmes's expression bore that particular intensity that marked his most challenging cases. The evidence was accumulating with methodical precision, yet the central mystery of the locked room remained tantalizingly beyond our complete understanding. "We must proceed with considerable caution, Watson," Holmes warned as our cab began its journey through London's labyrinthine streets. "The sophistication of this apparatus suggests a mind of exceptional cunning, one that has anticipated the possibility of investigation and prepared accordingly. The death of Mr. Harting may be merely the beginning of a larger and more dangerous enterprise." The fog had begun to lift, revealing the city in all its complex Victorian reality, yet I sensed that the mystery surrounding the gentleman who forgot to breathe was only beginning to reveal its true dimensions. Holmes's methodical investigation had uncovered the tools of murder, but the identity of the craftsman who wielded them remained hidden in the shadows of London's criminal underworld. Our return to Baker Street found Holmes in a state of barely contained intellectual excitement, his keen mind racing to connect the various threads of evidence we had gathered throughout our investigation. The familiar comfort of our lodgings provided the perfect sanctuary for the methodical analysis that would transform scattered clues into coherent understanding, and Holmes immediately set about arranging his chemical apparatus with the precision of a master craftsman preparing for his most important work. The glass vial recovered from Timpson's quarters received his primary attention, its contents subjected to a series of delicate tests that filled our sitting room with wisps of vapor and the sharp, clean odors of various reagents. Holmes worked with that concentrated focus I had come to recognize as the prelude to his most significant discoveries, each procedure designed to reveal the precise nature of the deadly compound that had claimed Mr. Harting's life. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, holding a strip of treated paper over the vial's mouth while applying a gentle flame beneath. The immediate reaction indicates nitrous compounds in significant concentration, yet combined with something far more sophisticated. The paper changed color through a series of distinct stages, each transformation speaking to my medical training of a preparation designed to affect the respiratory system with devastating efficiency. Holmes next turned his attention to the residue he had scraped from the brass bell plate at the Harting residence. Under his magnifying glass, this material revealed a faint, crystalline structure that caught the gaslight with an almost opalescent quality, indicating the presence of metallic compounds that had no legitimate place in the mechanism of a servant's bell system. "The delivery method grows clearer," Holmes observed, his voice carrying that note of grim satisfaction that marked his most significant deductions. "This residue suggests a catalytic reaction, Watson, designed to activate the compound at a predetermined moment. The bell rope served not merely as a signal device, but as a conduit for introducing the deadly vapors into that sealed study." I watched as he subjected the wire gauze respirator to careful examination, noting how the sweet medicinal scent intensified when exposed to gentle heat. The crystalline deposits on the inner fibers became more apparent under magnification, concentrated precisely where the device would have made closest contact with the wearer's breathing. "The apparatus becomes clear," Holmes continued, his long fingers tracing the path of evidence with mathematical precision. Mortimer's specialized glass ampoules designed for easy crushing, the narrow rubber tubing with precise fittings, the charcoal powder for eliminating residual traces, all components of a system designed to introduce specific vapors into a confined space while leaving minimal evidence of the intervention. Holmes moved to examine the fused glass pearl recovered from the Harting fireplace, holding it delicately in metal tweezers while applying the gentlest heat from his spirit lamp. A faint vapor escaped, carrying that same sweet, treacherous scent, though he was careful to avoid direct inhalation after the briefest exposure. "Not chloroform alone," he murmured, his grey eyes bright with the cold illumination of complete understanding, "nor simple ether. A volatile carrier married to a more treacherous partner, designed to lull the respiratory system while maintaining the appearance of natural repose." Before I could press him for further details, the sharp sound of our bell interrupted these chemical investigations. Mrs. Hudson's discreet knock was followed by the entrance of a telegraph boy, whose urgent manner immediately commanded our attention. Holmes tore open the yellow envelope with characteristic efficiency, his expression growing increasingly grave as he scanned the brief message. "From Lestrade," he announced, his voice carrying an edge of controlled anger I had rarely heard. Timpson has been found dead in lodgings near Pimlico, apparent suicide with a confession claiming responsibility for his master's death. The implications of this development struck me immediately. Then our investigation has forced the true perpetrator's hand, Holmes. Timpson knew too much and had become a liability. Holmes nodded grimly, already reaching for his coat with renewed purpose. Indeed, Watson, the death of Henry Timpson represents not the conclusion of this case, but rather the elimination of a potentially dangerous witness. Our opponent is tidying the board, as you say, removing pieces that might expose the larger game. As we prepared to depart for this new scene of apparent self-destruction, I observed that Holmes's expression bore that particular intensity that marked his most challenging cases. The sophisticated apparatus we had uncovered spoke of a criminal mind of exceptional cunning, one that had anticipated the possibility of investigation and prepared accordingly. The mechanism of Mr. Harting's death grows clearer with each revelation, Holmes observed as we descended to the street. Yet the identity of its architect remains hidden in the shadows of London's criminal underworld. We must proceed with considerable caution, Watson, for we are dealing with someone who possesses both the knowledge to devise such an elaborate system and the ruthlessness to eliminate those who might betray it. The fog had begun to gather once more, shrouding Baker Street in that peculiar atmosphere of mystery that seemed to accompany Holmes's most intricate cases, and I sensed that we were approaching the heart of a conspiracy that would test even his extraordinary deductive abilities to their utmost limits. The hansom that bore us through London's increasingly fog-shrouded streets moved with urgent purpose toward the less fashionable district of Pimlico, where Henry Timpson had supposedly met his end in a squalid lodging house. The familiar weight of impending revelation settled upon Holmes's aquiline features as we approached what Inspector Lestrade undoubtedly considered the convenient conclusion to our morning's investigations. Yet I could see in my friend's keen grey eyes that growing intensity which invariably preceded his most devastating exposures of criminal deception. The lodging house itself stood in stark contrast to the Georgian respectability of the Harting residence, its grimy brick facade and narrow windows speaking of transient accommodation, where few questions were asked and fewer answers volunteered. Inspector Lestrade awaited us at the entrance, his bearing radiating the professional satisfaction of a man who believed he had witnessed the tidy resolution of a complex case. "Straightforward suicide, Holmes," Lestrade announced with evident relief as he led us up the creaking stairs. Guilty conscience finally overcame the fellow, left a complete confession detailing how he murdered his master with some sort of poisonous vapour. The case is closed, I'd say, though I suppose you'll want to examine the scene for form's sake. The chamber where Henry Timpson lay in apparent repose was a cramped, poorly ventilated space that immediately assaulted our senses with that now familiar sweet, medicinal odour overlaying the more mundane scents of cheap lodging-house existence. The deceased valet occupied a narrow iron bedstead, his fair features bearing an expression of unnatural tranquillity that immediately aroused my professional suspicions. Upon a rickety table beside the bed lay what purported to be his confession, written in a hasty, uneven hand that seemed to tremble with either emotional distress or some more sinister explanation. Holmes approached the scene with his characteristic methodical precision, though I detected an undercurrent of controlled anger in his movements that spoke of personal affront at such crude attempts at deception. He began not with the body itself, but with a careful circuit of the room's perimeter, noting the single window's latch mechanism and the door's simple bolt arrangement, before turning his attention to the supposed suicide note. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, lifting the confession with tweezers and holding it toward the pale afternoon light filtering through the grimy window. The remarkable consistency of pressure throughout this document, Note particularly how the formation of individual letters varies significantly from the handwriting samples we observed in Timpson's personal effects at the Harting residence. Under his magnifying glass, the confession revealed telltale inconsistencies that became increasingly apparent as Holmes traced specific letter forms with his finger. The ink itself showed variations in flow and density that suggested either extreme duress during composition or, more likely, the work of an entirely different hand attempting to simulate the valet's natural script. Holmes next examined the deceased with the same clinical precision he had brought to bear upon Mr. Harting's remains. The familiar slate coloration at the extremities and the faint rosiness about the lips immediately confirmed my growing suspicions that we were witnessing the same sophisticated method of murder, disguised now by the presence of an empty laudanum bottle and the fabricated confession. "The same chemical signature, Watson," Holmes observed quietly, noting the slight yellowing of the nasal hairs and the oily residue that clung to the moustache. "Our gentleman has employed his proven apparatus once again, though adapted for different circumstances and designed to suggest an entirely different cause of death." The narrow fireplace yielded additional evidence under Holmes's methodical examination. Among the cold ashes lay fragments of fused glass that matched precisely the specialized ampoules described by Mortimer the chemist, their spherical shape and thin walls speaking eloquently of their intended purpose as delivery vessels for volatile compounds. "The mechanism grows clearer with each revelation," Holmes continued, extracting the glass fragments with tweezers and sealing them carefully in evidence envelopes. The same sophisticated delivery system, the same chemical preparation, the same attention to creating an appearance of natural or self-inflicted death. When questioned more closely, the sharp-faced landlady revealed that Timpson had received a visitor the previous evening, a gentleman of respectable appearance who had inquired about lodgings with particular interest in the building's layout and the privacy afforded by the upper rooms. Her description of the man's manner and bearing suggested someone familiar with the premises and confident in his ability to move about undetected. Holmes's examination of the confession yielded perhaps the most damning evidence of deliberate deception. By applying gentle pressure with a pencil to the blotting paper beneath, he revealed the ghostly impressions of words that had been written with far greater force than appeared on the visible document. "Observe the pressure variations, Watson," he said, indicating the revealed impressions. The original text was composed by someone pressing heavily with the pen, suggesting either anger or determination, yet the visible confession shows the light, uncertain strokes of a hand guided by another, or writing under extreme duress. The window examination revealed additional evidence of external interference. Though latched from within, the glass bore faint smudges on the outer surface that suggested someone had tested the security of the room from outside, while the sills showed traces of the same greyish-white residue we had encountered at the bell-rope mechanism in Mr. Harting's study. "The same calculating intelligence at work," Holmes observed grimly as we prepared to depart the scene, though operating now under pressure of time and the necessity of eliminating a potentially dangerous witness. Timpson knew too much about the true nature of his master's death, and his continued existence posed an unacceptable risk to our unknown perpetrator. As we descended the narrow stairs, Holmes's expression bore that particular intensity that marked his most challenging cases. The sophistication of the original crime had given way to more hurried methods, suggesting that our investigation was forcing the true architect of these murders to accelerate his timeline and take increasingly desperate measures to protect his larger scheme. "We are dealing with someone of exceptional cunning, Watson," Holmes warned as we emerged into the grey London afternoon. "Someone who possesses both the technical knowledge to devise such elaborate methods and the ruthless determination to eliminate those who might expose them. The death of Henry Timpson marks not the conclusion of this case, but rather the beginning of its most dangerous phase. The fog was thickening once more, shrouding the narrow streets of Pimlico in that peculiar atmosphere of mystery that seemed to accompany Holmes's most intricate investigations. Yet I sensed that we were approaching the heart of a conspiracy that would test even his extraordinary deductive abilities to their utmost limits, and that the gentleman who had forgotten to breathe was merely the first victim in a larger and more sinister design. "Tonight, Watson," Holmes said with quiet determination as we secured a hansom for our return to Baker Street, "we shall set our own trap. Our opponent has grown bold in his haste, and boldness, as you know, is often the criminal's ultimate undoing." The evening found Holmes in a state of controlled anticipation, his movements about our Baker Street lodgings carrying that particular energy which invariably preceded his most audacious strategic manoeuvres. The fog that had begun gathering during our return from Pimlico now shrouded London in its grey embrace, providing perfect cover for the elaborate trap he proposed to set. Yet beneath his methodical preparations I detected that cold anger which Holmes reserved for criminals who dared to mock the very principles of justice through their sophisticated deceptions. Holmes dispatched 3 telegrams in swift succession, each composed with the precision of a master strategist. The first summoned Inspector Lestrade and 2 reliable constables to the Harting residence, with specific instructions regarding their positioning within the servants' quarters and the mews beyond. The second, addressed to Sir Felix, requested that the household be absent for the evening under some plausible pretext, leaving the study exactly as it had been on that fatal night. The third telegram, crafted with meticulous care and written in a hand that startled me with its perfect imitation of Henry Timpson's cramped characters, was directed to Duke Street. This final message spoke of an article left in the wall by the study rope that the police had missed, and warned that it must be removed tonight before the new man discovers it. The communication specified 11 o'clock as the optimal hour when the house would be empty and the shutters drawn. Holmes entrusted this crucial missive to young Wiggins and his irregular battalion, with instructions for immediate delivery and continued surveillance of the recipient. From his extensive chemical cabinet, Holmes prepared a small phial of liquid that gave off sharp, antacid fumes, along with a modified respirator, whose gauze he had replaced with fresh charcoal and dampened wool. "For you, Watson," he said, handing me the protective device. "Don this at the first hint of that treacherous sweetness. I shall rely upon different safeguards." From his drawer he produced narrow strips of glazed paper and delicate feathers, which he affixed with gummed tape along the inner lip of the brass plate where the study bell rope emerged. We reached the Harting residence as dusk settled upon Kensington, the familiar Georgian facade now bearing an ominous quality in the gathering gloom. Lestrade awaited us with barely concealed impatience, though he submitted to Holmes's precise disposition of his men with professional deference. The pantry cupboard door was positioned ajar by the merest fraction, with Constable Foster crouched within, his eye fixed upon the bell mechanism and his hand ready for immediate action. Holmes dusted the brass plate with the faintest smear of lampblack, demonstrating to Foster how any disturbance would betray attempted tampering. In the study above, he set the metronome to its customary 48 beats per minute, the mechanical rhythm filling the chamber with that same inexorable count that had marked Mr. Harting's final moments. Upon the desk he placed a carefully prepared decoy note, its ink barely dry, purporting to be a memorandum from Sir Felix regarding certain papers to be collected on the morrow. "An inducement to haste," Holmes murmured, adjusting the shutters so that a narrow blade of lamplight would betray any movement within to observers outside. From his pocket he produced a small brass valve fitted to tubing no thicker than a quill, which he inserted within the bell aperture after removing the cut rope's remaining fringe. The other end he led to the fireplace, where he placed a saucer of his sharp-smelling neutralizing solution. We took our positions as the household's departing wheels faded into the fog-muffled distance. Holmes placed me near the desk with the modified respirator at my elbow, while he melted into the shadows between window and bookcase, commanding both the bell aperture and the garden beyond. The metronome's relentless ticking marked time with oppressive precision, each beat bringing us closer to the moment of revelation. At 10 minutes before the appointed hour, the taper Holmes had positioned upon the mantel flickered almost imperceptibly before recovering. His hand rose in silent warning. The faintest whisper of disturbed air lifted the feather at the bell plate, followed by that now familiar sweet scent. I donned my respirator immediately as Holmes's neutralizing apparatus began its quiet work, dulling and flattening the treacherous aroma. A stifled exclamation rose from below, followed by the crash of struggling bodies and Lestrade's triumphant voice. "Got ya, my lad!" Within moments, Holmes appeared with their prisoner, a man of neat, clerkly appearance whose pale hair and careful manner immediately identified him as someone intimately familiar with the sophisticated apparatus we had been tracking. His gloved hand still clutched a length of rubber tubing, while his breast pocket revealed visiting cards bearing Dr. Royston's name and 2 spherical glass ampoules wrapped in tissue. Not the doctor himself, Holmes observed quietly, as the captured man maintained contemptuous silence, but one thoroughly schooled in his methods. The residue upon his cuffs and the lampblack on his fingers tell their own story, Inspector. Holmes examined the telltale feathers, now pressed nearly flat by the attempted introduction of deadly vapors through the bell system. "Had our diversion not been in place, Watson, this gentleman would have succeeded in eliminating what he believed to be crucial evidence, while simultaneously removing any witnesses who might have discovered it." The prisoner's steady composure spoke of one trained to obey and endure, yet Holmes's penetrating gaze noted every detail, the callus suggesting frequent use of precision tools, the slight burn mark indicating exposure to chemical apparatus, the nervous habit of checking his pocket watch that marked him as Timson's mysterious correspondent. "We shall find your equipment still warm in Duke Street," Holmes said with quiet certainty, and the prisoner's involuntary reaction confirmed what we had suspected. This was merely the hand that had executed another's design, and the true architect of these elaborate murders remained to be confronted before the night's work was complete. The captured assistant's resolute silence spoke more eloquently than any confession, his trained composure revealing the discipline of one prepared for precisely such circumstances. Yet Holmes's penetrating analysis revealed details that no amount of professional stoicism could conceal. The chemical stains upon his cuffs, the precise calluses marking his fingertips, and the subtle tremor betraying recent exposure to volatile compounds. Inspector Lestrade secured the prisoner with professional efficiency, though I observed Holmes's attention remained focused upon larger considerations than this single capture. "We have secured the instrument, Watson," Holmes murmured as we prepared to depart the Harting residence. "But the hand that wielded it awaits our attention. Dr. Royston's establishment will bear immediate investigation, for I suspect we shall find evidence of hasty preparation and the destruction of incriminating materials." Young Wiggins materialized from the fog-shrouded street as our small procession prepared for Duke Street, his sharp eyes bright with intelligence. "He's in, sir," the boy reported to Holmes with conspiratorial satisfaction. "Been pacing his front room this past hour, up and down regular as clockwork. Sent his maid away near an hour past. No other visitors, but there's been lights moving about the back rooms." Holmes's hand touched the boy's shoulder in silent approval before we mounted our hansom for the journey through London's grey arteries. The fog had begun to thin, revealing the city in patches of gaslight and shadow, yet the atmosphere remained charged with that peculiar tension that precedes the final revelation of a complex mystery. The building housing Dr. Royston's practice stood silent in the November night, its upper floors dark save for a single window, where a pale light flickered with nervous irregularity. The perfumer's shop below remained shuttered, though Holmes detected immediately the sharp chemical odours that spoke of recent activity in the floors above. A narrow alleyway provided access to the building's rear, where fresh scratches around the service entrance lock and muddy footprints upon the threshold confirmed our suspicions of hurried activity. Holmes's skeleton keys made swift work of the simple lock, admitting us to a narrow staircase that ascended through increasingly pungent chemical atmospheres. The familiar sweet scent that had marked both crime scenes now pervaded the building with concentrated intensity, overlaid by sharper notes suggesting the hurried destruction of volatile materials. The consulting room we entered bore unmistakable signs of systematic evacuation. The metronomes had vanished from their table, leaving only faint circular impressions in the dust, while the wall chart displaying respiratory diagrams hung in torn fragments. Most significantly, the numbered glass bulbs containing Dr. Royston's specialized preparations were absent, their shelves bearing only ghostly outlines where they had rested. Dr. Royston himself emerged from the private laboratory beyond, his silver hair dishevelled, and his pale eyes bearing the wild intensity of a man driven beyond rational calculation. In his trembling hands he carried the tools of his deadly trade, one of his specialized glass ampoules and a length of rubber tubing fitted with the narrow brass valve we had come to recognize as the delivery mechanism for his lethal vapors. "Mr. Holmes," he said, with elaborate courtesy that failed to mask his desperation, "I had rather hoped our paths would not cross again this evening. Your reputation for persistence, however, preceded any reasonable expectation of discretion." Holmes faced him with that implacable calm that characterized his most dangerous encounters. "The persistence was necessary, Doctor, to understand the remarkable sophistication of your apparatus. Perhaps you would enlighten Inspector Lestrade regarding the precise mechanism by which you persuaded Mr. Harting to cease breathing while maintaining such perfect serenity in death." Royston's composure cracked visibly at Holmes's direct challenge. "You understand nothing of the revolutionary nature of my work. The combination of Eastern breathing disciplines with modern pharmacological enhancement represents a breakthrough in respiratory therapy." "Indeed," Holmes replied with cold precision, "though your breakthrough proved rather more final than therapeutic. Let me demonstrate your method for the inspector's benefit." He moved to the laboratory bench where the sophisticated distillation apparatus stood, its various components still warm from recent use. "Mr. Harting followed a precise routine each evening," Holmes began, his voice carrying that note of quiet authority that compelled attention. "At 9 o'clock sharp, he would retire to his locked study for 90 minutes of breathing exercises, timing them to a metronome set at 48 beats per minute. He wore your specially prepared respirator, believing it to enhance his respiratory function." Holmes produced the brass valve, and rubber tubing recovered from the captured assistant. What Mr. Harting did not know was that the bell rope in his study, which had been giving trouble and required wedging to prevent false alarms, had been subtly modified. This device was expertly inserted into the wall aperture where the bell rope emerged, with narrow rubber tubing threaded through the wall cavity and connected to a delivery system operated from the servants' quarters below. Dr. Royston's face had grown ashen, yet he maintained his desperate silence as Holmes continued his methodical exposition. At precisely 10:30 each evening, when the metronome would cease its ticking and Mr. Harting would remove his respirator, believing his treatment complete, your accomplice, Henry Timpson, would release the wedge from the bellboard in the servants' hall. This created a minute suction within the bell rope's conduit, sufficient to draw one of your specialized glass ampules through the delivery system and into the study's chimney flue. Holmes lifted one of the spherical glass containers, its thin walls designed for easy crushing. The ampule would impact against a strategically placed metal plate, rupturing and releasing a concentrated burst of your lethal compound, a volatile mixture of concentrated ether and nitrous compounds masked by sweet aromatic essences to disguise its treacherous nature. Mr. Harting, having just removed his protective respirator, would inhale the concentrated vapors directly, inducing rapid and painless cessation of breathing while leaving him with that expression of perfect tranquility. The bell rope was then severed, Holmes concluded, and its tassel placed in the cold fireplace to suggest inexplicable behavior by the victim. The charcoal powder you required from Mortimer served not to purify the air, but to absorb any residual chemical traces before the authorities arrived. A locked-room murder designed to appear as natural causes or medical mishap. Royston's remaining defiance crumbled entirely. Aubrey was going to expose my entire practice, he whispered, his voice barely audible. He had discovered the true nature of my treatments and threatened to report me to the authorities. Years of research, revolutionary advances in respiratory therapy, all would have been destroyed by one man's narrow-minded prejudice. Revolutionary advances in murder, you mean? Lestrade interjected grimly, stepping forward with handcuffs ready. Dr. Alaric Royston, you are under arrest for the murders of Aubrey Harting and Henry Timpson. As the arrests were completed and the prisoners led away, Holmes stood in contemplative silence amid the apparatus of sophisticated murder. The case of the gentleman who forgot to breathe had revealed layers of deception that spoke to the dangerous intersection of scientific knowledge and criminal intent. The most dangerous criminals, Watson, Holmes observed as we prepared to depart, are often those who possess the intelligence to devise elaborate methods yet lack the moral foundation to constrain their application. Dr. Royston's apparatus was indeed revolutionarily evil in its conception and execution. The fog had lifted entirely as we emerged into the London night, revealing the city in all its complex Victorian reality. Yet I knew that the memory of this case would linger long in my mind, serving as a reminder that even the most tranquil death might conceal the most sophisticated murder, and that the gentleman who forgot to breathe had been, in truth, persuaded to stop by one of the most ingenious criminal minds we had ever encountered. The days that followed our nocturnal confrontation in Duke Street brought with them the methodical satisfaction of justice properly administered. Inspector Lestrade, moving with unusual dispatch, secured Dr. Royston's laboratory apparatus and account books, discovering within those stained benches and meticulous ledgers the final proofs that would ensure both men faced the full weight of the law. The newspapers, predictably, seized upon the sensational elements of the affair with headlines far more picturesque than accurate, though the essential fact spoke eloquently enough of criminal ingenuity perverted to murderous purpose. Sir Felix called at Baker Street the following afternoon, his naturally reserved manner softened by profound relief that warred visibly with lingering sorrow. The transformation from the anxious gentleman who had first sought our assistance to this composed figure spoke eloquently of the burden that had been lifted from his shoulders. He brought with him a private note of gratitude and a request, couched with that delicacy peculiar to his class, that Holmes might consent to present the facts in a light least injurious to the family name. Holmes, who possesses as much chivalry as he does exactitude, assured him that the truth itself, properly ordered, required no embellishment. "Your brother's death was neither natural nor accidental," Holmes began, settling into his familiar chair with that air of quiet authority that marked his most significant revelations, but rather the result of a carefully orchestrated murder designed to appear as medical mishap. It was in our sitting room, with the November dusk closing down upon Baker Street and the faint murmur of London's traffic rising like a distant sea, that Holmes provided the complete exposition of the case. He began, as ever, with the first inconsistency, that delicate fissure through which the blade of his reason had entered the mystery. Mr. Aubrey Harting detested scents of any kind, Holmes observed, his keen eyes fixed upon the dancing flames as though reading the final chapters written in their flickering patterns. Yet he was discovered in a room faintly perfumed with sweet medicinal aromas. That contradiction would strike any intelligent observer, but it was the unfinished memorandum and its curious blotting that settled my course of investigation. Holmes explained how the note addressed to R, with its incomplete message, "Remind me," had been deliberately crafted to create the ghostly impression of "Mind me to breathe" upon the blotter beneath. Sir Felix had testified to his brother's characteristically light touch with the pen, yet the heavy, deliberate pressure required to force those mirrored words into the blotter could not possibly have been Aubrey's hand. Someone had written the complete phrase upon a separate sheet laid over the blotter, an early attempt to inscribe a lie upon the very air of that study. From that seemingly trivial detail, Holmes proceeded to dissect the entire apparatus with methodical precision. The severed bell rope, with its clean edge showing slight scorching, and the brass plate bearing greyish-white chemical residue, had been the crucial delivery mechanism. The wedged bellboard in the servants' hall, ostensibly to prevent false alarms, had actually served to create the precise suction necessary for the murder weapon's deployment. The apparatus revealed itself piece by piece, Holmes continued, producing the various exhibits that had been recovered from both crime scenes. Mortimer's spherical glass ampoules designed to shatter upon impact and release their deadly contents, the narrow rubber tubing and brass valve fitted to the bell rope aperture, the charcoal powder to absorb incriminating chemical traces, the metronome that conditioned the victim to respiratory compliance while marking the precise moment of attack. The wire gauze respirator, far from providing protection, had been systematically treated with trace amounts of the aromatic compounds to accustom Mr. Harting's senses to their presence. The faint, crystalline sheen upon its inner gauze was perfume's ghost, Holmes observed, training the victim to accept without alarm the scent that would herald his destruction. Holmes's exposition revealed the diabolical elegance of the complete system. At precisely 10:30 each evening, when Mr. Harting's breathing exercises concluded and he removed his respirator, believing his treatment complete, Timson would release the wedge from the bellboard. This created sufficient suction within the bell rope's conduit to draw one of the specialized ampoules through the delivery system and into the study's chimney flue, where it would shatter against a strategically placed metal plate. The released vapor, a sophisticated mixture of concentrated ether for rapid effect, nitrous compounds for respiratory paralysis, and aromatic essences for concealment, would flood the study invisibly, Holmes explained. Mr. Harting, having just removed his protective respirator, would inhale the concentrated compound directly, inducing swift and painless cessation of breathing, while leaving him with that expression of perfect tranquility that so troubled his brother. The motive, as Dr. Royston's own desperate confession had revealed, stemmed from Mr. Harting's growing suspicions about his treatment. "Your brother possessed too keen an intellect to remain deceived indefinitely," Holmes told Sir Felix. He had begun to recognize that his condition worsened rather than improved under Dr. Royston's care, and threatened to expose the doctor's dangerous experiments to the medical authorities. Royston, facing financial ruin and professional disgrace, chose murder over discovery. Henry Timson's subsequent death had been necessitated by his increasing instability and the danger he posed as a witness to the original crime. The forged confession, with its simulated tremor and inconsistent pressure, had been composed by another hand entirely, Holmes noted, while the same deadly apparatus was employed a second time, though with less sophistication due to the urgency of eliminating a dangerous accomplice. Sir Felix listened to this complete revelation with growing horror at the calculated nature of his brother's murder, yet also with evident relief that the truth had finally emerged from the shadows of apparent impossibility. The sophistication of their methods, ironically, created a trail of evidence that no conventional murder would have left, Holmes assured him. Dr. Royston's very cleverness became the instrument of his undoing. As our visitor prepared to depart, he turned to Holmes with profound gratitude. "My family owes you an enormous debt, Mr. Holmes. Without your intervention, Aubrey would have been remembered as the gentleman who forgot to breathe, and his murderers would have escaped justice entirely." Holmes dismissed such expressions with characteristic modesty, though I observed the slight satisfaction that touched his aquiline features. The case presented certain points of interest, particularly in the ingenious application of scientific knowledge to criminal purpose. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who possess the intelligence to devise elaborate methods, yet lack the moral foundation to constrain their application. After Sir Felix's departure, Holmes settled into contemplative silence, his extraordinary mind already turning toward other mysteries as this case took its place among his documented triumphs. The evening papers would soon carry sensational accounts of the arrests and the revelation of the sophisticated murder apparatus, though the complete details of Holmes's deductive process would remain our private knowledge. "A most instructive case, Watson," Holmes observed finally, reaching for his pipe with that air of intellectual satisfaction that marked the successful conclusion of a challenging investigation. "It demonstrates once again that the most impossible crimes often yield to methodical analysis, and that the appearance of natural death may conceal the most unnatural murder. The criminal mind finds its greatest satisfaction in the elegance of its method, but elegance, properly observed, becomes the very rope by which it hangs itself." He struck a match and applied it to his pipe, filling our familiar lodgings with aromatic tobacco smoke that seemed to cleanse the air of lingering chemical treachery. "Science is a fine sword, Watson, but one must observe the oath of its bearing, or we shall have many more gentlemen who forget to breathe. It is the particular danger of our age that clever hands too often outrun steady hearts." As the gaslight flickered against our windows and the sounds of London's evening traffic rose from the street below, I reflected upon the remarkable journey that had led us from a locked room and an impossible death to the complete exposure of criminal conspiracy. The case of Mr. Aubrey Harting would stand as testament to Holmes's unparalleled ability to penetrate the most sophisticated deceptions through pure application of logical deduction. "You will make something of it, no doubt, Watson," Holmes said, with that weary, affectionate irony he reserved for my literary endeavours. "Be kind to Lestrade in your account, spare Sir Felix's sensibilities, and for mercy's sake do not give the metronome more prominence than it deserves. We have, I believe, a telegram from Dartmoor regarding a hound that may prove to be no ordinary beast, and I should prefer our next case to involve air that is entirely safe to breathe." I promised him the discretion he requested, though I confess the image of that tranquil face and the malignant ingenuity that created it will long remain etched upon my memory. The game, as my friend would say, had been played to its conclusion, and once again the forces of order had triumphed over chaos through methodical application of reason and relentless pursuit of truth. In a world where even the act of breathing could be transformed into an instrument of murder, It was reassuring to know that minds like Holmes's stood as guardians against such sophisticated evil,